For 10 years, nobody on our side of the range had heard the sound of that man's voice. Not the trappers who left salt beef on his fence line out of an old, unspoken debt. Not the preacher who climbed to his cabin twice a winter and came back down each time with the same coffee untouched on the same cold porch. Not the boys who dared each other, every summer, to knock on his door and run. He had gone up into the pines the year his own name stopped meaning anything to him, and he had taken his voice up there with him, and the mountain had kept it. I used to think a man like that had nothing left in him worth spending, that the silence was the whole of him, the way rot is the whole of a fallen log, soft all the way through, nothing at the center anymore. I was wrong about that. I want to tell you exactly how wrong, because I stood 20 feet from him the night he broke it, and I have never in my life heard a sound cost a person so much. It started with a boy nobody wanted, and a river that wanted him too badly. The water took the bridge before it took the boy, and I remember being grateful for that in the ugly, arithmetic way a man is grateful when disaster hands him a warning first. I was on the North Road with 2 heifers and a bad knee, coming back from the Renner place, when the spring melt came down out of the high country all at once. You have to understand what that country does in late April. All winter the snow lies up in the peaks holding its breath, and then one warm week loosens it, and everything the mountain has been saving comes down the cold water in a single afternoon. The river you could step across in October becomes a brown, muscled thing that pulls fence posts and calves and whole cottonwoods along like it's ashamed of nothing. I heard the bridge go. That's a sound I won't forget, not a crack, more a long groan and then a swallowing, the timbers giving up all at once and the water taking them without slowing down to notice. I got the heifers off the road and stood there with my heart going, and I thought, well, that's the crossing gone till June. And then I heard the other sound. A child screaming downstream. I want to be honest about myself here, because this story isn't about me being good. My first feeling wasn't courage. It was a kind of sick lurch, the body understanding before the mind does that it's about to be asked for more than it has. My knee had swollen up bad that whole spring. I was 51 years old and I had buried a wife 2 winters back, and I had, if I'm truthful, been coasting toward the end of things without much fight left in me. I did not want to run toward that river. Every honest part of me wanted to pretend I hadn't heard. I ran anyway. I want that on the record, not because it makes me anything, but because I've noticed that the running anyway is most of what a person ever manages, and the wanting to run away underneath it never really goes away. You just get older and learn to move despite it. I keep a ledger. Have all my life. My father kept one and his father before, a little oilcloth book where you set down the day's business, what you spent and what you were owed and what the weather did. My wife used to laugh at me for writing down feelings in the margins like they were debts too. I mention it because I've gone back and read the entry for that day more times than is healthy, and it's just 4 words in my bad hand, river up, boy in it. As if the rest could be trusted to memory. It could. It has. The boy was maybe 40 yards down, where the river bent hard against the rock shelf and threw up a standing wave of dirty foam. He'd been swept off the far bank and pinned against a snag, an old drowned cottonwood wedged crossways in the current, and he had his arms hooked over a limb, and the river was doing everything in its considerable strength to peel him loose. He couldn't have been more than 8. Skinny in the way that isn't natural, the way that comes from a long stretch of not enough. His mouth was open and he was screaming, but I could barely hear it over the water, and even then part of me registered that a child alone at that hour, on the far bank where nobody lived, was already a story with a sad shape to it. I knew whose boy he was, roughly. Everyone did. The Teague place had burned in February, chimney fire, the whole family scattered or gone, and the youngest had been passed around the valley like a debt nobody wanted to hold. 31. That was what I'd heard some fool call him because he'd been the 31st name on the county orphan roll, and the name had stuck the way cruel things stick. Rowan was his real name. I'd learned that later. That day he was just a boy the river had, and me on the bank with a rope on my saddle 40 yards back, and a knee that wouldn't take the run. I made it maybe 10 yards before I understood I couldn't reach him. The bank sheared off into fast water. There was no shallow, no gravel bar, nothing to wade from. To get to him, I'd have had to go in, and going in there meant the same snag would take me. And then there'd be two of us for the river, and one of us grown enough to know exactly what was happening. I stood at the edge with the rope in my hands. I'd run back for it without deciding to. And I did the arithmetic, and the arithmetic said no. And I have never hated a true answer more. I threw the rope anyway, twice, both times short. The current bellied it downstream before it could reach him, and he wasn't going to let go of that limb to grab for a line even if I'd landed it on his chest. The cold was already in him. You could see it, that stiffness, the way his screaming had started to hitch and slow, the body beginning to shut its shutters against the water. He had minutes, maybe not even that. And that's when the man came out of the trees. I didn't hear him. That was the strange part. You'd think a man that size, and he was a big man, gone to gray, broad as a door and moving with a heavy sureness. You'd think he'd make noise, but the river ate all of it. He was just suddenly there at the edge of my vision, coming down off the timbered slope on the far side of the flood with a coil of something over his shoulder, and I knew him the way you know weather. Everyone in the valley knew him without knowing him at all. The mountain man. The one who hadn't spoken in 10 years. Crane, the old-timers called him, though I'd never once heard the name used to his face because nobody had gotten close enough to use it. He didn't look at me. I was hollering. I don't even remember what, just noise, the useless noise of a man who wants to be part of a thing he can't do anything about, and he never once turned his head my way. His whole attention was on the boy. He came down that slope to a point maybe 15 feet upstream of the snag, on the far bank, and he unslung the coil, and I saw it was rope, good rope, and he moved with the calm of a man who has already lost the fear a situation is supposed to cause him. I've thought about that calm a great deal since. At the time I mistook it for coldness. I thought, that man's been alone so long he doesn't even flinch at a drowning child. It was only later, putting the whole night together, that I understood it was the opposite. It was the calm of a man who had already decided, long before that afternoon, exactly what his own life was worth, and had it priced low, and was therefore free to spend it without hesitating over the cost. He tied one end of the rope to a standing spruce, hard against its base, 3 fast wraps and a hitch I couldn't see from where I stood but which held, and he took the other end and he waded in. I stopped hollering. There wasn't any air in me to holler with. The cold water took him at the thighs, and I watched it try to lift him and fail. He was heavy enough and set his feet wrong side to the current, sliding one boot and then the other, keeping the tension in the rope so it caught him each time the river shoved. But the snag where the boy hung was out past the point a man could wade to. There was a stretch of deep, fast channel between the shallows and the drowned tree, and I saw him reach the edge of it, the place where the bottom fell away, and I saw him understand that the rope wasn't long enough to let him cross that channel and still stay tied. He had to choose. Untie and swim the deep part free, and if he missed the snag, the river would have him and the boy both and no rope on either of them. Or stay tied and reach and not reach far enough. He untied. I made a sound. I don't know what it was. He looped the free end around his own chest and under his arms a quick, ugly harness, and he let go of the anchored line and he went into the deep water, and for a moment the river had him completely. His head went under and the coil of slack rope snapped out behind him toward the spruce, and I thought, that's it, that's 2 of them gone. And my whole body had gone cold and useless. Then his head came up right at the snag. He'd aimed it. 10 years alone in that country, and he'd read the current like a page he'd read before, and he came up with one arm already over the same limb. The boy was hooked too, and the river slammed them both against the drowned tree and held them there, pinned in the roar. I could see him talking to the boy. His mouth was moving. I remember that clearly, and I remember thinking it strange even in the middle of everything, the silent man, The man who hadn't spoken in a decade, and here he was with his lips going a mile a minute at a half-drowned child. I couldn't hear a word, but I saw the boy's face change, saw the screaming stop, saw the man get one big hand around the back of Rowan's coat and start, inch by inch, to work them both along the snag toward the shallow side. It took a long time. It felt like an hour. It was probably 4 minutes. The rope on the man's chest ran back to the spruce, and every time the river surged he'd get an arm around the boy and lean into the anchored line and let it take the strain, and then he'd move them another foot. The boy had stopped fighting entirely by then. I couldn't tell if that was trust or if the cold had finished the job of shutting him down, and I don't think the man could tell either, and I watched him keep moving anyway because the not knowing didn't change what had to be done. They came out of the deep channel into the thigh-deep shallows, and I finally had something I could do. I went in on my side as far as I dared up to my waist, my bad knee screaming and the cold like a set of teeth, and I got my rope out, and this time the throw was close enough. Not to the man. He didn't need me, but I got it near enough that when he made the last of the shallows he could reach out and take it, and I hauled. And between his legs and my arms we got the two of them up onto the gravel where the bank had slumped low enough to climb. He laid the boy down and went to work on him without a wasted motion, turned him, pressed the water out of him, and there was a bad moment where nothing came and then a worse better moment where the boy heaved and coughed up half the river and started, thinly, to cry. That thin crying was the best sound I have ever heard. I don't expect to hear a better one. I got my coat off and got it around Rowan and the man let me do it. That was the first thing that passed between us. He let me help. He crouched over the boy with his gray hair plastered down and river running off him in sheets and his chest heaving like a bellows, and he looked for one moment at me, right at me. And I opened my mouth to say something. Thank you, my God, are you hurt? Who are you? And he gave the smallest shake of his head. Not unkind. Just, don't. As if words were a thing he'd sworn off, and my offering him mine was a temptation he needed me not to put in his way. So I didn't. I held the boy and I kept my own counsel, and the three of us stayed there on the gravel while the light went long and gold, and the river kept on tearing at the world like nothing at all had happened. Here is where I should tell you what I knew about the man, which was almost nothing, and what the valley knew, which was worse than nothing, because it was a story, and stories about silent men are always more cruel than the truth. They said he'd killed somebody. That was the common version, that he'd been a hard man down in the mining camps, or a soldier who'd done something no soldier should, and that he'd gone up the mountain to hide from the law or from God or from himself. They said he didn't talk because he had nothing decent left to say. Children scared each other with him. The mountain man will get you. I'd said it myself once to a nephew without ever once thinking about the actual person the threat was hung on. The truer version I only got in pieces over the weeks that followed from the preacher, and from an old trapper named Halloran who was the closest thing the man had to a friend, if leaving beef on a fence line counts as friendship, which up in that country it does. Crane, Elias Crane, had come to the valley more than 20 years back with a wife and, in time, a daughter. He'd had a place down in the low meadows, a good place, and he'd been by all accounts a talker, even a laugher, a man who sang in the church and told long stories and was generally reckoned good company. And then there'd been a winter, the bad winter, the one the old people still measured other winters against, and a fever had come through the valley, and it had taken his wife in November and his daughter in January, the girl not quite 10 years old, and Crane had buried them both in ground so frozen he'd had to burn fires over the graves for 2 days to soften it enough to dig. And then he'd stopped talking. Not all at once, Halloran said. It came on him slow. He'd sold the low place and gone up into the pines, and for a year or two he'd still say a word here and there, thank you, or leave me be. And then, one spring nobody could remember the last time they'd heard his voice, and it dawned on the valley that he'd gone silent altogether. And by then the story had already curdled into the Killer in the Hills version, because that made a better tale than the truth, which was only that a man had loved two people more than he could stand to, and they had died, and he had decided the price of speaking was more than he wanted to pay ever again. I didn't know most of that on the gravel bar, but I knew enough to understand, watching him crouch over that half-drowned orphan, that I was seeing something the valley would never have believed. The killer in the hills does not go into a flood after a stranger's child. He'd gone in without a half-second's hesitation, and he'd untied his own safety to do it, and now he was chafing warmth back into a boy nobody in the valley had wanted, with a tenderness that did not fit any story anyone told about him. The boy, Rowan, was the other half of the thing, and I should tell you about him too, because the man's silence would have meant nothing without the particular boy it eventually broke against. He'd been unwanted, the way children sometimes are through no fault of anything but bad timing. The Teagues had been poor and then they'd been dead, and Rowan had been the leftover, 8 years old and quiet and a little strange, and the valley had passed him from household to household the way you pass a chore. Nobody was cruel to him exactly. That would almost have been better. Cruelty at least treats you as real. He'd just been endured. Fed and housed and never once looked at as if his being there was anything but a weight. The Renners had him at that point, and it was from the Renner place he'd wandered 3 miles, in the wrong direction, up the far bank, and I have wondered since whether a boy that unwanted wanders because he's careless or because some part of him is testing, over and over, whether anyone will come looking. Nobody had come looking. That's the part that sits in me. When I finally got him back to the Renners that evening, half frozen and wrapped in my coat, they were surprised to see him, not with relief, with the mild surprise of people who hadn't yet noticed he was gone. Hadn't missed him. 3 hours in the spring flood and he had not crossed one adult's mind. I stood in the Renner's doorway with that knowledge going through me like cold water, and I made a decision I hadn't planned to make. I said I'd take him. Said it before I'd thought it. My wife was 2 years dead and my house was empty, and I was a 51-year-old man with a bad knee and no earthly business raising a child, and I heard myself offer to do it anyway, and the Renner's relief was so immediate and so total that it turned my stomach. They'd have signed him over to a passing peddler. He was a weight-off, that was all he'd been. But this isn't my story, not really, and I knew even then that the boy coming to live under my roof was only the middle of a thing that had started up on the mountain and would have to end there. Because Rowan wouldn't settle. He was grateful, too grateful in the way that broke your heart, thanking you for a bowl of stew like you'd handed him gold, flinching when you moved too fast, working himself sick trying to be no trouble at all so he wouldn't be sent on again. I did what I could. I'm not a soft man and I didn't know the first thing about children, but I fed him and I didn't yell and I taught him the animals. And slow, over the weeks, he stopped flinching quite so much. He started sleeping through some nights. Once in June, I heard him laugh, and I had to go stand out by the barn a while. But there was one thing he wanted that I couldn't give him, and it wasn't from me he wanted it. He wanted the man. He asked about him constantly, the big one who came in the water. Was he all right? Where did he live? Why didn't he ever come down? Could we go see him? I put him off. I told him the man liked to be alone, which was true, and that we shouldn't bother him, which I believed. But the boy had had his life saved by a stranger who'd gone into a river to reach him and had talked to him in the middle of the current, and though Rowan could no more remember the words than I could hear them, he remembered the fact of them. Somebody had spoken to him when he was dying. Somebody had thought him worth the breath. In a life where he'd been number 31 and a weight and a chore, one person had once, for 4 minutes in a flood, treated him as the most important thing in the world. Of course he wanted to go back to that. Anyone would. So in July I gave in. I told myself I was doing it to settle the boy. The truth is I wanted to see the man again too. I wanted to understand what I'd witnessed. And there was a debt in it. He'd done a thing I couldn't do. Saved a boy who was now mine to raise, and I don't hold with leaving debts unmarked. My ledger had an entry with no balance against it, and it itched. We climbed up to the cabin on a Sunday, Rowan and I. with a haunch of smoked venison and a sack of the early beans and no real idea what we'd find. The trail up was worse than I remembered, and my knee made me pay for every foot of it. The boy went ahead, light and quick, too eager, and I kept telling him to slow down and wait and not to get his hopes up. The man might not even come to the door. The man might send us straight back down. The cabin, when we reached it, was better kept than the valley's stories deserved. Tight-chinked, a good roof, a woodpile squared away with a care that told you something about the man's mind. There was a garden, a real one, tended, and a couple of goats, and everything about the place said that whatever Elias Crane had given up, he had not given up on living. He'd only given up on being heard. He was at the woodpile when we came into the clearing. He straightened up and saw us and went completely still, and I watched him take in the boy, and I watched something move across that big, weathered face that I did not have a name for. Rowan didn't wait for permission. He never did learn to. He crossed that clearing at a dead run and threw himself against the man's legs and wrapped both skinny arms around him and held on, the way a boy holds on who has spent his whole short life not being held, and he said, into the man's shirt, muffled and fierce, you came in the water, I knew you were real." And Elias Crane stood there with his arms out from his sides like a man who's forgotten what to do with them, looking down at the top of that boy's head, and I saw his throat move, and I understood with a jolt that went all the way through me that after 10 years in that clearing, something in him was trying, against all its long habit, to speak. He didn't, not that day, but I saw him want to, and I knew then that we'd be back, and that whatever the valley thought it knew about the silent man was about to be proved wrong in front of the one person who'd never heard a single story about him, who only knew that once, when it mattered most, he had come. We went up the mountain 7 more times before he said a word. I counted them. Of course I counted them. I told you about the ledger. Each Sunday got its line up to Crane's, beans and the last of the ham. Boy chopped kindling 2 hours, wouldn't stop. C showed him the whetstone. Little entries, nothing in them, and yet reading them now I can see the whole shape of a thing being built, week by week, out of chores and silences. Because that's how it went. The boy would run to him and the man would stand there and take it, and then, not knowing what else to do with a child in his clearing, Elias Crane did the only thing he had left to offer. He taught. He couldn't talk, so he showed. He showed Rowan how to hold an axe so it wouldn't turn in his hands, how to read the goat's moods, how to find the hen's hidden clutches, how to lay a fire that would catch first strike in wet weather. He showed him with his hands, patient past any patience I'd ever had, taking that skinny wrist and setting it right and nodding when the boy got it, and this is the part that got me smiling. The silent man smiled at the boy, slow and rusty, like a gate that hadn't swung in years, but a smile. And Rowan talked enough for both of them. He filled that clearing with chatter, the dammed-up chatter of a child nobody had ever listened to, and he'd narrate everything, and he'd ask the man questions and then answer them himself. And somewhere in the 3rd or 4th week, I realized the boy had stopped expecting words back and had simply decided that Crane's nods and hands and slow smiles were his talking, a language of their own, and that he, Rowan, was fluent in it. The boy had learned the man's silence the way you learn a person's face. It didn't lack anything to him. It was just how Elias spoke. I mostly stayed back by the woodpile and let them be. I'll be honest, there were Sundays I felt like a spare part, an old man with a bad knee watching 2 people who needed each other and neither of whom needed me. But I'd made the boy mine, and this was plainly good for him. And I'd carried a debt up that mountain, and I could see it slowly getting paid in a currency I hadn't expected. So I kept my peace and I whittled. That's my other habit. I whittle when I've nothing to say. Little animals, badly. And I watched a reclusive man and an unwanted boy build something in a mountain clearing that neither of them, I think, had believed they'd ever have again. Or ever at all. It couldn't have lasted like that. Good things balanced on silence never do. And the thing that tipped it came in September, and it came, the way these things do, dressed as disaster. Rowan got sick. It came on fast, the way it does with children. He was fine on a Thursday, and by Saturday night he was burning up, out of his head, his little chest laboring, and I knew the shape of it because I'd seen it before and I'd lost people to it before, and the fear that came up in me was a fear I'd sworn I was done feeling. I'd buried a wife. I had promised myself in a low, cold way that I would never again love anything enough to be destroyed by losing it. And here I was at 2 in the morning with a wet cloth on a fevered boy's forehead, understanding that the promise had been broken weeks ago, up in that clearing, without my ever noticing the moment it went. The doctor was 2 days' ride the wrong way. There was no bridge, the flood had seen to that in the spring and the county hadn't rebuilt. I did what I knew. Cool cloths, willow bark, keeping him breathing. But by the second night he was worse, and I was one man alone in a house with a dying child, and I was losing, and I knew I was losing, and somewhere in the black middle of that night I did the only thing left to me that wasn't giving up. I saddled my horse, and I rode up the mountain in the dark to get the one person I thought might know something I didn't. I don't know what I thought Crane could do that I couldn't. Nothing, probably. Herbs, maybe. A man who'd lived alone in that country 20 years knew things about the mountain's medicine that the rest of us didn't. But I think, underneath, it wasn't his knowledge I went for. I think I couldn't bear to lose the boy alone. I think I wanted the one other person who loved him there when it happened, if it was going to happen. Grief you can survive alone. Barely. But I'd learned, burying my wife with no one but the preacher, that there's a particular horror in loving something to death with no witness, and I could not do it twice. I hammered on that cabin door in the dark like a madman. He came fast, he must have been half awake, the way old solitary men are, and he opened the door with a lantern and a knife, and I got out 3 words before my voice went to pieces. The boy fever. I've never seen a man move like he moved then. He was dressed and had a bundle down from the rafters, dried things, roots, I don't know what, before I'd finished telling him how bad it was, and he was on my horse behind me, and we were going down that mountain trail in the dark faster than any sane man rides it, and the whole way down I could feel him behind me, this great silent mass of a man, absolutely rigid with a fear I recognized because it was the twin of my own. He worked over Rowan the rest of that night and into the day. Brewed things, and got the boy to take them a swallow at a time, and stripped the fever with cool water, and I'll swear to this, sat with the boy's hand in both of his enormous ones and held on, the way the boy had held on to him in the clearing that first day, as if he could keep him on this side of things by main strength and the refusal to let go. And somewhere in the worst hour, near dawn, when the boy's breathing had gone shallow and frightening and I truly believed we were losing him, Rowan surfaced, just for a moment. His eyes came half open, glassy and enormous in his wasted little face, and they found the man bent over him, and the boy's cracked lips moved, and what he said, barely a thread of sound, was, "Don't go quiet again." I didn't understand it. I thought it was fever talk, but I saw what it did to Elias Crane. I saw him take that in like a blade, and I saw 10 years of held silence come up against the one thing it could not withstand, which was a child he loved asking him, mistaking the fever for distance, thinking the man was already leaving him the way everyone had always left him, asking him not to disappear. And Elias Crane opened his mouth, and out of it, cracked and ruined and unused, in a voice like a hinge that hadn't turned in a decade, came words. "I'm here." It broke in the middle. He forced it. "I'm not going anywhere. I'm here, Rowan. I'm right here." I had to leave the room. I'm not ashamed of it. 51 years old, and I went and stood in my own kitchen with my hand over my mouth because a man had spoken, and I could not bear the size of what it cost him. 10 years. 10 years he'd kept it locked up, priced too high to spend on the preacher or the trappers or God himself, and he'd broken it open at last for a fevered orphan who wasn't even sure he'd heard. But the boy heard. That's the thing. Weak as he was, he heard, and something in his face eased, and he went back down into the fever, but a different way this time, a resting way instead of a sinking way, and I have always believed, though no doctor would sign his name to it, that the voice did as much as the medicine. that the boy had been letting go partly because he thought he was, once again, unwanted and alone, and that the sound of the man saying "I'm here" gave him something to hold to, and he held. He turned the corner by nightfall. By the third day he was asking for food. By the end of the week he was sitting up, thin as a rail and cross about being kept in bed, which is how you know a child is going to live when they start complaining about it. Ilya's crane stayed. That's the plain end of it, though nothing about it was plain to live through. He stayed down off his mountain in my house at first, and then, when the boy was well, in a cabin we raised together on the near meadow, close enough that Rowan could run to it. He never became a talker again, not the way Halloran said he'd been in the old days, the singer and the storyteller. Whatever that had been, the fever winter had burned it out of him 20 years back, and it didn't come back. But he spoke. Carefully and not much, and mostly to the boy, and every word of it deliberate, the way a man spends money he's decided at last is worth spending. The valley didn't know what to do with it. The killer in the hills had come down and turned out to be a big, gentle, grieving man who taught a foundling to split wood and read the weather. Some folks couldn't let go of the old story, people rarely can. The story had been doing something for them, giving them a monster to point their children away from, and they resented having it taken back. But most came around. Halloran wept when he heard Crane's voice again. The old trapper wept and then pretended it was the smoke. The preacher said something about God's timing that I didn't much care for and didn't argue with. I went back to my ledger. I settled the debt at last in my own private accounting. I wrote it out on the page for that terrible September and drew the line under it. Paid. Though the truth is I've never been able to figure who paid whom. He saved the boy in the river, and then the boy saved him from the silence, and I only ever stood at the edge of it holding a rope that was always a little too short, whittling bad little animals, keeping count. But I'll tell you the thing I keep coming back to. The thing I set down in the margin in my bad hand and read more than is good for me. A man decides what his own life is worth, and mostly he decides it alone in the dark after a loss, and he prices it low, and he's not wrong to. Grief is a true accounting, and a man who's lost enough is right to reckon himself cheaply. Ilya's crane had done that. He'd priced his own voice at nothing, because the two people worth saying anything to were under the ground, and he'd been correct in his way for 10 cold years. What he hadn't reckoned on, what none of us reckon on, I think, was that the accounting doesn't stay closed. That a river comes up some spring afternoon and there's a boy in it, and the old low price you set on yourself becomes exactly the thing that lets you spend your life to save him, because you never valued it enough to hoard it. And then the boy lives. And then the boy needs you. And then, one fevered dawn, the boy asks you not to go quiet, and you find that the voice you buried was never gone at all. It was only waiting for something worth the cost. I think about the day we climbed up there in July, the boy running across the clearing. You came. I knew you were real. And the man standing with his arms out from his sides, not knowing what to do with them. He learned what to do with them. It took a river and a fever and the better part of a year, but he learned. Rowan is 14 now, taller than I ever was and getting on toward the man's size. He splits our wood and reads the weather off the peaks, and he can lay a fire that catches first strike in the wet, and he talks a blue streak. That boy always did, and Ilya's mostly just listens, the way he always did, nodding, that rusty slow gait of a smile. Last week I heard the two of them out at the woodpile, and the boy was going on about something, some plan, some scheme, the way he does, and I heard Elias say something back low, and I heard Rowan laugh. I didn't go closer. Some things you don't need to hear the words of. I just stood in my doorway, an old man with a worse knee than ever, and I listened to the sound of a voice that a mountain kept for 10 years, spending itself, at last, on a boy who was worth breaking the silence for.